Hi, you're watching the Johnny's channel. Today's video will be about the case of a serial killer that happened in Russia about 20 years ago. And there will be a lot of pretty graphic footage and descriptions in this case, so viewer discretion is advised. And this case probably will be the example of worst police work of all the cases I have ever researched. If you will find this video interesting, please leave a like at the end, and let's begin. This story began in 1998. In 3 Russian cities near the Ural Mountains, schoolgirls started disappearing and were later found murdered. These cities were Novouralsk, Nevyansk, and Pervouralsk. They are located a few dozen kilometers from each other and are surrounded by picturesque nature, impenetrable forests and mountains. The indigenous peoples of these lands have passed down legends for centuries about evil spirits of the mountains and forests, to whom young women were sacrificed. But in reality, it was not mountain spirits, but a brutal killer who could not be stopped for years. The first murder happened on September 12, 1998, in the city of Novouralsk, when 12-year-old Masha Polevtseva left her home and headed towards the bus stop. It was a warm Saturday. She had arranged with her grandmother to visit her in the village to help dig up potatoes, as her grandmother could no longer manage without her granddaughter's help. Upon arrival, Masha found out that her grandmother was unwell and could not work in the garden that day. Masha's grandfather, who was also at home, was heavily drunk, and he yelled at his granddaughter and refused to let her into the house. And this decision cost his granddaughter her life. Masha decided to head back home. On her way back to the city, she got off the bus and headed to the checkpoint. Novouralsk is a closed city. Since it houses the production of highly enriched uranium, all entrances to the city are blocked and guarded, and only residents of the city can enter. All others can only pass through with a special written permit. Masha was very close to passing through the checkpoint when a light-colored Zhiguli car pulled up beside her. An unknown man got out of the car, and when Masha came near him, he grabbed her and forcefully pushed into the back seat of the car. The criminal drove Masha along the highway towards the neighboring city of Yekaterinburg, and near the 292-kilometer mark, he turned into the forest. After driving along a dirt road, the criminal sexually assaulted his victim twice and then strangled with his bare hands. After this, he covered her body with branches he found nearby and set it on fire. The next day, Masha's parents filed a missing person report with the police. However, for some unknown reason, the police did not open a criminal case until May of the following year. They later justified their actions by saying that children often run away, travel to another city with their boyfriends, and so on. However, in this case, it was complete nonsense. It was obvious that Masha, who had no significant conflicts with her parents, could not just disappear without a trace. Such unprofessionalism on the part of the police, which continued in this case, gave the criminal free rein and allowed him to kill for years. Masha's body was discovered by tourists only in September of the year 2000. So on February 14, 1999, another attack occurred. It was 5 months after Masha's murder. 13-year-old Oля Lamaeva was walking through the streets of Novouralsk. Her parents had recently divorced, and Oля lived with her mother. However, a week before the attack, Ola's mother had gone to visit her new boyfriend in one of the prisons. Ola was staying with her grandmother on the other side of the city, but on February 14th, her mother returned to Novouralsk from the prison visit, and Ola, with her backpack, walked across the city to her mother's home. And she was only a few meters away from her house when an unknown man, hiding in a phone booth, grabbed her and dragged into his car, which he used to take his victim to an abandoned place near one of the local factories. That day, Ola's mother thought that she had stayed with her grandmother, and her grandmother thought that her granddaughter was already home with her mother. It wasn't until the next evening when the school called Ola's parents and reported that their daughter had not attended classes. And only then her parents realized that the child had simply disappeared. But in fact, Ola was abducted by a Novouralsk serial killer. After assaulting her, murdered, strangled Ola with a seatbelt and then threw her body into one of the snowdrifts in an industrial area. A few days later, he returned to his victim's body, dismembered it in many parts, and scattered them in various places around the area, dumps, wells, and abandoned buildings. The remains were found only a few months later when the snow melted, but since there were stray dogs in the area, it was very difficult to determine to whom those remains belonged. It took another 6 months for the examination to establish that the remains belonged to Olga, based on her items and dental records. At that time, a coach from gymnastics school where Olga trained was suspected of the murder. He was even arrested and prosecuted, but later, due to lack of evidence, he was acquitted. Naturally, given that the first attack was not even investigated, no one suspected that a serial rapist and killer had begun operating in the area. On June 22, 1999, 12-year-old Katya Shmyrina went with her parents to visit relatives who lived in a small village near Novouralsk for their child's birthday. The feast lasted about 1.5 to 2 hours, and Shmyrin family began preparing to go home. Katya got bored, and while waiting for her family to take her home, she went outside to a path leading to a small pond. It was around 7 p.m. and many people were by the pond that day, so Katya's parents did not worry about their child. After some time, when they finally said goodbye and started to leave, they went outside and realized that Katya was not there. The people who were by the pond also did not see her. The family began searching. They filed a police report, called relatives, searched the surrounding forests, and even hired a handler with a search dog, but there was no trace of Katya. They could not imagine what had actually happened to their daughter. The serial killer in the same white car drove up to her and forcibly pushed her inside. He then drove her towards the highway and turned into the forest at the same 292-kilometer mark. Katya met the same fate as the previous victims of the monster. Her charred remains were also discovered only in September 2000, at the same time as Masha Polevtseva's remains. A criminal case in this instance was also initiated with delay, only 2 months later, but there was no significant progress in the case. A few months later, Katya's father, who had taken to drinking after his daughter's disappearance, died under the wheels of a train, presumably unable to bear the grief of losing his child. Meanwhile, the criminal understood that he was getting away with everything. Therefore, the next attack was committed less than 2 months after Katya Shmyrina's murder. On August 12, 1999, in the city of Nevyansk, which is not far from Novouralsk, 11-year-old Natasha Kozlova was kidnapped from a bus stop on the outskirts of the city. She had gone out of town to pick up berries to her family's summer house. On the way back, an unknown man lured Natasha into his car, offering her a ride to the city center. Natasha trusted the monster, but instead of taking her to the city, he drove to the same place, the turnoff at the 292-kilometer mark on the local highway. The criminal gave his victim alcohol and then assaulted her sexually. Katya's remains were found 2 weeks later by a mushroom picker walking in the area with his dog. Her remains were scattered around by the criminal. The examination determined that the cause of Katya's death was a blow to the head with a blunt object, likely the back of an axe. A criminal case was opened on the day her body was found, but it was later suspended. By that time, the police had already received 4 reports of missing minors, and given that the body of the latest victim was found near a forest strip, it would have been logical for them to search the area around the location where the victim's body was found. If the police had checked at least a few hundred meters around, they would have found the remains of other victims, and it would have become obvious that a serial killer was operating in the area. However, for some unknown reason, the police did not do this. Maybe the Novouralsk serial killer would have been caught then, because the evidence could have been found on the crime scene. Or even an ambush could have been set, so when the monster would have returned with another victim, he would have been caught. But nothing was done. On October 9th of the same year, 16-year-old Marina Kublo arrived in one of the local villages to visit her friend, but she never made it to him. As she was walking through the village from the local store, the criminal caught up with her, grabbed her by the neck and pushed her into his car. The same thing happened to Marina as to previous victims, at the same 292-kilometer mark on the highway. After the victim was strangled, the murderer covered her body with dirt and placed a huge branch on top of it. The criminal case was also soon suspended by the police since no leads were found, and the police convinced the family that Marina would soon return home. It was advantageous for the police not to investigate these crimes because they spoiled their statistics, which negatively affected their salaries, and it was beneficial for them not to add more unsolved crimes to their record. Marina's body was found only a year later by tourists. A month and a half after Marina Kublo's murder in the city of Nevyansk, an attack was carried out on 12-year-old Lena Buzulukova. Lena left school and was walking along the road. The attacker got out of his car and ordered Lena to get in. She started to struggle and scream, despite the criminal holding a knife to her throat. Soon, a few passers-by appeared in the distance. The criminal got scared, jumped into his car, and drove away. Lena was the first to survive an attack by the Novouralsk serial killer. And also, she was the first to see the criminal's face and car, but the police did not give much importance to this attack. Although, if they had created a composite sketch and checked the owners of similar cars, they could have significantly narrowed down the circle of suspects, but this was not done. Even the murderer, fearing that he might be identified after the failed attack, went into the hiding for 6 months. But in the summer of 2000, when it became clear that the police were not making any special efforts to catch him, he began killing again. The next crime was committed on July 14th of the year 2000. On that day, President of Russia arrived in one of the neighboring cities to visit an arms exhibition. And for this reason, most of the police forces from the area were sent to ensure security. They guarded the highway along which the president was supposed to pass. At the same time, in the city of Nevyansk, two sisters, 14-year-old Katya Mamaeva and 11-year-old Nastya Mamaeva, were returning from the city to their home village. They were walking along a forest path, parallel to the highway. The murderer drove past them in his car, and after noticing the girls, he drove a bit ahead and left his car. Taking a knife with him, he hid along the path the sisters were walking on, waiting for them to come close. When they walked by, he attacked 14-year-old Katya, but she managed to break free from the monster's grip and ran to the side. But the attacker then grabbed the confused 11-year-old Nastya and held the knife to her throat. He demanded that Katya return or threatened that Nastya would suffer. Katya acted heroically, and for the sake of her sister, she did not run away and let the criminal capture her. The last thing Nastya heard was her sister telling her to run home. The criminal pushed Katya into the trunk of his car, threatening her with a knife. But since the highway was blocked by the police, he drove his victim to another place in the forest, where he did the same to her as to his other victims. He then covered her body with rocks and dirt. In the meantime, Nastya reached home and told her parents what had happened, and they panicked and contacted the police. But the police arrived at the crime scene only 2 hours later because there were few available police units that day, and it was already too late. However, the detectives realized whom they had missed, and this was the first attack with witnesses in the case. Not far from the crime scene, two men saw a white Zhiguli car driving slowly along the railway tracks. Then the car stopped, and a man in a white t-shirt and blue jeans got out of the car and walked towards the path, close to the place where Katya Mamaeva was kidnapped. The witnesses were also able to create a composite sketch of the suspected criminal. He was about 175 centimeters, which is about 5 feet 8 inches, and he was between 17 and 25 years old. However, the police were unable to find Katya Mamaeva's body, so apart from the composite sketch, they had no other leads. After this, possibly fearing that he might be caught, the criminal went into hiding. The next attack was carried out on July 7th, 2002. On that day, 40-year-old Natalia Karyakina and 9-year-old Malika Sharipova went to the forest to pick berries near one of the highways leading to the city of Yekaterinburg, close to the small village called Talitsa. After picking berries, they came out to the highway, probably to reach the bus stop or catch a ride. A car drove up to them, and a young man offered to give mother and daughter a ride home. Natalia agreed, possibly because the place where they lived was relatively far from the areas where attacks had occurred from 1998 to the year 2000, and she had not even heard about them. But soon after they got in the car, Natalia realized that this person was not going to take them home. After driving only about 300 meters, the driver turned into the forest and, threatening them with a knife, tied Natalia and her daughter's hands. First, he took Natalia out of the car, but since she actively resisted, he killed her and returned to the car to Malika. He treated her especially cruelly, as if trying to make up for the 2 years he had not committed attacks. The bodies of Natalia and Malika were discovered the next day near one of the local rivers. No fingerprints were found on the victims' belongings, and the murderer also attempted to throw the victims' clothes into the river, but did not throw them far enough, so the clothes remained on the shore. Forensic experts managed to extract blue cotton fibers from the clothes, which most likely belonged to the murderer. The local police officers who were investigating the case only recorded information about the murders, not mentioning that the victims were sexually assaulted, possibly to avoid worsening their statistics of unsolved cases. Now, the murderer realized if he committed attacks further from the areas he usually targeted, the police would also be less likely to catch him. He found his next victim outside the city of Novouralsk, also near a highway. The murderer followed a young woman walking along the road and, threatening her with a knife, forced into his car. Soon he stopped in a deserted field and, upon seeing his victim, he realized that she was a 39-year-old woman and not the teenager as he at first thought. The victim resisted fiercely, provoking the serial killer's rage. He began to savagely beat her with a blunt object and strangled her with a loop. After she stopped resisting and weakened, the criminal raped her and then finished her off with 8 knife blows. 10 days later, the murdered woman's body was found, but the investigation was soon suspended due to a lack of evidence, and the police did not connect this attack with the previous ones. And soon another attack was carried out. The murderer offered a ride home to 16-year-old Olga Denisova, who had missed the last bus at a bus stop. She got into the front seat of the car with a stranger. After taking her to a remote area and assaulting her, the criminal dragged Olga out of the car and began beating her up, and then Olga was strangled. When she lost consciousness, he tied a tow rope to her legs and drove about 100 meters while dragging Olga behind his car. Afterward, he slashed her throat with a knife and fled. But incredibly, Olga survived. She had regained consciousness while the criminal was already leaving and pretended to be dead, which saved her life. Olga was so incredibly lucky that the knife wound was not fatal. 5 days after the incident, a criminal case was opened. And you'll be surprised under which article. The police opened a case for hooliganism with the use of weapons, although it was obvious that this was not just hooliganism, but the work of a serial killer. But the police either did not believe Olga's story, or didn't want to take on an unsolved case under serious charges. On July 26, 2003, the Novouralsk monster committed his last attack. 16-year-old Yevgeny Petrov, who had recently finished school, was engaged in athletics. She was a successful athlete, repeatedly winning local running competitions, and was also one of the top students in her studies. In July of 2003, she was spending summer in a sports camp. So on July 26, Zhenya's coach woke her up and informed her that she needed to participate in a morning long-distance run. Zhenya did not want to go because she was very sleepy, but the coach insisted. During the run, which partly took place in a deserted, wooded area, Zhenya found herself alone at one point, and at that exact moment, a stranger drove by in a white car. He stopped next to her and, threatening her with a knife, grabbed Zhenya by the hands and dragged her into the back seat of his car. He then took her to an abandoned place and tied her hands with wire. Zhenya fought back fiercely against the monster, but she was brutally beaten and then assaulted. She died from 15 stab wounds and her body was thrown into a small river. Immediately after Zhenya's disappearance, the investigators took the case more seriously than they did before and began searching for witnesses and questioning locals. In early August of 2003, a local resident, 27-year-old Yevgeny Petrov, came to the police department and told investigators that he had seen a girl being taken away in a car. He claimed that he was driving through the forest at the time. Yevgeny could not accurately name the brand or the model of the car in which Zhenya was taken, and he claimed that men that were in this car were going to take Zhenya into the hospital because they, as he said, had hit her with their car. However, the investigators noticed how insistently and in detail the witness described Zhenya, whose body has not yet been found at the time, although the police suspected that she might have fallen victim to a serial killer. And this so-called witness then began to seem even more suspicious to investigators. By profession, he was an auto mechanic and even often participated in car races, but he could not identify the car of the supposed criminals he saw in the forest, although it was daytime and he claimed to have even exchanged a few words with the man behind the wheel. When Zhenya's body was found shortly after, there were no injuries consistent with a car accident. Given all the suspicions, the police decided to arrest Yevgeny Petrov, who at the time worked in transportation department of an electrochemical plant. Soon, searches were conducted in his apartment and workplace, and in Petrov's desk drawer, earrings were found that were identified by the parents of the last victim, Zhenya Perizolova. And also fibers matching Petrov's clothing were found on the clothes of one of the victims. Now, all the criminal cases of murders were combined into one. According to rumors to get Petrov to talk, he was placed in a common cell with many other prisoners, and it was hinted to all the others why he was detained. The next morning, Petrov himself volunteered for interrogation and began to talk about all his crimes, although before he was placed in the cell with other prisoners, he categorically refused to confess to the murders. It is not known why Petrov initially came to the police to testify that he was a witness to Zhenya's abduction. Perhaps he considered himself to be very smart and thought he could easily fool the police, although some sources claim that Petrov was simply seen on the day of the attack near the abduction site in his car, when he offered schoolgirls a ride, and possibly for this reason he went to the police himself to deflect suspicion. During interrogations, he claimed that every time he decided to kill his victim, he did it spontaneously under the influence of so-called external forces. He was probably trying to be declared insane so that he would be sent to a psychiatric hospital rather than prison. However, little in Petrov's biography indicated that he was mentally ill. He was married and had a son, and his relationships with colleagues at work were pretty normal too. His plant had a cross-country team, and Petrov participated in races as a mechanic. Together with his plant team, he traveled extensively across Russian regions where he likely committed more crimes, but establishing his involvement in them is very difficult. But behind this quiet facade of an ordinary, average man, there was a cruel psychopath hidden. From childhood, Petrov was accustomed to always escaping responsibility. He was born in 1975 in the closed city of Novouralsk, and at 17 he was caught stealing a computer from school, but he was only given a suspended sentence. Later, during his military service, he almost killed his commander, but the case was closed by the military prosecutor's office because his father hired a good lawyer who helped protect his son and again avoid punishment. Being a sadist and psychopath, Petrov decided that he would always get away with everything, and after he began attacking schoolgirls, the unprofessional and sometimes negligent actions of the police allowed him to kill with impunity for 5 years, from 1998 to 2003. He drove his personal car on his days off, finding solitary victims and luring them into his car by force or deceit. After his confession, Petrov began traveling with the police to the crime scenes, describing in detail what he did to his victims. He showed no particular remorse, but considering how he described the crimes and the details he remembered, and how closely it matched the discovered bodies, there could be no doubt about his guilt. During the trial, some relatives of the victims could not bear the descriptions of what Petrov did to their children. Psychiatric examination declared him mentally sane, although he had obvious signs of psychopathy and was a very cunning and deceitful person. During the investigation, Petrov was placed in a special cell where he was under round-the-clock surveillance, but he made several attempts to take his own life, possibly again trying to be declared insane. On April 6, 2005, the regional court sentenced Yevgeny Petrov to life in prison for 10 murders. In the year 2020, Petrov confessed to the murder of another 16-year-old victim in a different region of Russia. And it is now officially believed that he had 11 victims, although in theory there could be many more. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Tell me all of your thoughts about this video, what's your opinion about the police work in this case. Thank you, and I hope to see you again. Bye.